Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a really deep philosophical puzzle, and we're going to be guided by the philosopher Ian Hacking. We're getting into a question that's kind of fundamental. How is it that we can actually learn something new about the universe just by thinking? All right, let's just dive right in. The heart of this whole thing is a paradox that has stumped scientists and philosophers for literally centuries. I mean, how can you just sit down, close your eyes, and purely by thinking, come up with some new truth about the way the world works? It sounds impossible, right? Like magic? The amazing historian and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, he just framed the problem perfectly. He's asking, look, if you're only using stuff you already know, how can you possibly end up with brand new knowledge? It's kind of like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat that you know was empty to begin with. So these little mental puzzles are what we call thought experiments. You know the ones, like Einstein imagining what it's like to chase a beam of light, or Galileo picturing dropping two different cannonballs from the Tower of Pisa. They're basically stories we run in the laboratory of the mind. And, well, there's a huge debate about what's really going on in our heads when we do one. And this is where things get really interesting, because this debate basically splits the philosophical world into two main camps. They're looking at the very same thing, this mental process, and they're coming to totally different conclusions about what's happening. Is it all just logic, or is it something more like an experience? So in one corner, you've got the argument view. A guy named John Norton is the big champion here. He says that every single thought experiment is really just a logical argument wearing a disguise. The story, the imagery, that's all just window dressing. You could, in theory, just strip all that away and be left with a cold, hard, step-by-step proof. But the other side, the experience camp, they say, whoa, hold on a second. They argue that if you strip away that story, you've actually destroyed the whole experiment. For them, the narrative and our ability to really picture ourselves in that scenario, that's not just a detail. That is the experiment. Okay, so if it's not just a logic puzzle, what in the world is going on in our minds? Well, the experience camp, they've got three main flavors of an explanation. And it's a really fascinating range of ideas. First up, you've got James Brown, who suggests this sort of Platonism, the idea that we're not figuring something out, we're actually seeing a timeless, abstract truth, kind of like a sudden flash of mathematical insight. Then there's Nancy Nersessian, who thinks we're running these incredibly complex simulations in our heads, almost like a supercomputer. And finally, David Gooding talks about embodiment, the idea that what convinces us is the bodily feel of it, of truly imagining what it's like to be there, dropping that cannonball. Okay, so this is the moment when our guide for this explainer, Ian Hacking, steps onto the stage. He's listened patiently to all these arguments from both sides, and, well, he arrives with some pretty sharp criticism for everybody. To put it bluntly, Hacking is just completely unconvinced. He looks at all these detailed, complex theories, Platonism, mental models, hidden arguments, and he basically says, yeah, these explanations do extraordinarily little for me. For him, these grand theories don't actually seem to explain much of anything. So rather than just adding his own complicated theory to the pile, Hacking suggests we look at the problem from a totally different angle. And he finds his inspiration in the work of another giant of philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein's idea is that the key isn't the experiment itself, but what he calls the memorable picture it creates. A thought experiment works, he says, because it gives us this powerful, sticky image that just locks in the new way of seeing things. It persuades us, and then it stays with us. And this idea, this concept of a memorable picture, well, that's what leads Hacking to his final, decisive verdict on the question we started with. So here we are, the big question. Are they like real experiments you'd find in a lab? You know, living, breathing things that you can tweak and adapt and retool over the years to find new things? Do they actually evolve? Hacking's answer is about as clear and direct as you can get. It is a simple, definitive no. Thought experiments absolutely do not have a life of their own. His argument is this: real, physical experiments, they're organic. They grow, they mature, they evolve. You can take an old experiment and retool it for some totally new purpose. But thought experiments? Nope. They're the exact opposite. They are fixed, perfected, unchanging. Hacking compares them to a perfectly told joke or one of those stubborn optical illusions. They're built to do one very specific job, and they do it the same way every single time. So here's the bottom line. Thought experiments are not living organisms. They are icons. They're these perfectly polished, unchanging images, and their entire job, Their whole purpose is to expose a deep tension between two different ways of seeing the world. They don't evolve, they exist to shatter one picture of reality and replace it with a new one. And that, hacking says, is their one and only job. And that really leaves us with a powerful, lingering question, doesn't it? If these thought experiments are these perfect little tools for shattering old ways of thinking, what deeply held picture of our world today is just waiting for the right memorable image to come along and replace it for good?